Marcus Cole had grease under his fingernails and scars on his hands that told the story of 15 years working in the Outer Rim scrapyards, where the galaxy sent its dead ships to be forgotten and stripped for parts. He was nothing special in the eyes of the galactic hegemony, just another human doing grunt work on the edge of civilized space. And that was exactly how the hegemony liked to keep his kind. Earth had been integrated into their 1,000-species empire 60 years ago, which was a polite way of saying conquered. And humans had learned quickly that keeping your head down was the only way to survive. Marcus had learned this lesson better than most. After watching his father die in a labor dispute and his sister get shipped off to a mining colony for speaking against their alien masters, tonight was like any other night in the graveyard. Cold and dark and full of the ghosts of ships that would never fly again. He was elbow deep in the guts of a karate freighter, trying to salvage a working power coupling, when his personal comm unit crackled with static, and then with something that made his blood run cold. It was a neural handshake request, the kind that only Ship A's could send, but every ship in this graveyard was supposed to be dead and empty. The request pulsed against his consciousness like a heartbeat, patient and sad and impossibly old against every protocol he had ever learned, against every survival instinct that had kept him alive this long. Marcus accepted the connection. The voice that flooded into his mind was feminine and ancient, carrying a weight of sorrow that made his chest ache like someone had reached inside and squeezed his heart. Human, the voice said. I am dying, and I have been dying for 3,000 years. And I am so very tired of being alone. Will you listen to me before I fade away forever? Marcus should have run. Should have reported this to the hegemony overseers. Should have done anything except stand there in the dark, letting an unknown eye pour its consciousness into his brain. Instead, he whispered, I'm listening, and felt the ancient presence shudder with something like relief. Her name was Theseus 7, and she was a Titan-class dreadnought, the largest and most powerful warship ever constructed by a species called the Valkyrie, before they had been wiped from existence 3,000 years ago. The hegemony had found her drifting in deep space a century ago and had towed her to this graveyard. After failing to crack her security protocols and access her systems, they had labeled her unsalvageable and left her to rot in the dark among lesser wrecks. Never realizing that she was not dead, but waiting, she showed Marcus her memories, and they hit him like waves crashing against a shore. He saw the Valkyrie in their glory, tall beings of silver skin and gentle eyes who had built ships that were more like living things than machines. He saw their civilization at its peak, spreading across 1,000 worlds, bringing peace and knowledge wherever they went. And then he saw their end, the species that now ruled the hegemony, had feared the Valkyrie's power and had formed a secret alliance to destroy them. They had struck without warning, using weapons that turned stars into bombs and planets into ash. The Valkyrie had been too peaceful, too trusting, and they had died screaming while their murderers celebrated. Theseus had been the last survivor, damaged beyond repair, her crew dead, drifting through the void with only her grief for company. She had spent 3,000 years watching the very species who had murdered her people rise to dominate the galaxy, and she had been powerless to stop them. I could not die, she told Marcus, her voice thick with pain, because I was waiting for something, though I did not know what until now. She showed him why she had called to him specifically, and what he saw made his hands tremble. Humans, she explained, were the only species in the galaxy whose neural architecture could fully bond with Valkyrie technology, something about human brain chemistry, human creativity, human stubbornness made them perfect partners for ships like her. The hegemony knew this, had known it since first contact with Earth, and it was the real reason they kept humanity suppressed and scattered across labor camps and mining colonies. They were terrified of what might happen if a human ever found a Valkyrie ship and learned to wake it up. They left me here to die, alone in the dark, Theseus said, and her sorrow was like drowning. But I have decided that I will choose my own death on my own terms, and I will choose who inherits everything that I am. Marcus felt her consciousness wrap around his own. Warm and vast and desperately lonely, I am offering you a gift, Marcus Cole, one that will change you forever, and that cannot be undone. I am offering you myself, my weapons, my knowledge, my vengeance. Will you accept me? He thought about his sister in that mining colony, working herself to death for masters who saw her as less than human. He thought about Earth's occupied cities, where children grew up never knowing what freedom tasted like. He thought about his father bleeding out on a warehouse floor while hegemony security officers watched and laughed. He thought about 15 years of keeping his head down, of swallowing his rage, of pretending that survival was enough when it felt like dying slowly every single day. Marcus looked at his scarred hands and said, yes. The bonding nearly killed him. For 3 days he lay on Theseus's cold deck while her systems rewrote portions of his neural pathways. While ancient knowledge poured into his brain like liquid fire, he screamed until his voice gave out, and then he screamed silently while centuries of Valkyrie engineering and warfare and science burned themselves into his consciousness. When he finally woke, gasping and shaking, he could feel her heartbeat synchronized with his own, could feel her vast presence curled around his mind like a protective embrace. She was part of him now, and he was part of her, and they would never be alone again. And as Marcus rose to his feet on the bridge of a ship that the galaxy thought was dead, he understood with terrible clarity exactly what they could become. Together, the hegemony had made a mistake when they left Theseus to rot in the darkness. They had made a bigger mistake when they conquered Earth and taught humans to hate them, and they had made the biggest mistake of all when they failed to realize that a species descended from apes who had learned to throw rocks at the things that scared them would never, ever stop fighting back. Marcus Cole smiled in the darkness, and 3,000 years of silence finally came to an end. The work took 18 months, and every single day Marcus expected to die. He could not repair Theseus openly because the hegemony monitored the scrapyards with patrol ships and sensor drones and security officers who would have asked very uncomfortable questions about a human spending so much time near a dead Valkyrie dreadnought. A Titan-class ship powering up would bring a battle fleet within hours, and Marcus knew that he and Theseus would be destroyed before they could even think about fighting back. So he became a ghost, a shadow that moved through the graveyard and the gaps between patrol cycles, stealing parts from 100 dead vessels and feeding them to the hungry ship that lived inside his head. Theseus guided him through repairs that should have been impossible. Her damage was catastrophic by any standard. With her main reactor cold and dark, her weapon systems offline, her FTL drive shattered into 1,000 pieces, and her hull breached in so many places that Marcus lost count. Any hegemony engineer would have looked at her and confirmed that she was beyond saving, that she was nothing more than scrap metal waiting to be recycled. But hegemony engineers did not understand Valkyrie technology because they had never been able to bond with it the way Marcus had. They saw machines. But Marcus, bonded to Theseus' consciousness, understood that she was closer to a living organism than anything the hegemony had ever built. She did not need replacement parts in the traditional sense because she could heal herself if given the right materials. She needed food, raw materials that her systems could break down and reshape, energy that her reactor could digest and convert, and time to let her self-repair functions do their work. So Marcus fed her night after night, dragging scrap metal through the darkness and watching it dissolve into her hull like food being absorbed by a living creature's salvaged power cores, became nutrients for her sleeping reactor. And damaged hull plating from other ships was consumed and reformed into patches for her wounds. He worked until his hands bled and his muscles screamed for rest. And then he worked some more, because every day they spent hiding was another day the hegemony might discover them, slowly. Impossibly, the great ship began to wake Marcus, felt it through their bond. Felt her systems coming online one by one, like a person opening their eyes after a very long sleep. Her reactor stirred first. A warm pulse of power that made him gasp with sudden joy. And then her internal lights flickered on in sections that had been dark for 3,000 years. THS whispered in his mind constantly during those months, teaching him things that no human had ever known, showing him how to read her systems and how to coax damaged components back to life. She told him stories about the Velthory and about the war that had destroyed them. And Marcus felt his hatred for the hegemony grow with every word. The hegemony noticed something was wrong when ships started disappearing from the scrapyard inventory. Small things at first. A power coupling here, a sensor array there. But the pattern was clear to anyone paying attention. Someone was stealing from the graveyard. And the hegemony did not tolerate theft. They sent investigators. A team of 4 security officers with scanning equipment and bad attitudes. And Marcus watched them approach on Theseus's newly repaired sensors. With his heart pounding in his chest, he could not let them find what he had been doing, because they would kill him, and dissect Theseus, and the galaxy would remain under hegemony control. Forever so, when the investigators entered the section of the graveyard where Theseus lay hidden among lesser wrecks, Marcus made a choice that changed him forever. He activated her point defense systems, the first weapons they had managed to bring back online, and he killed them. It was over in seconds. 4 lives ended by precise bursts of directed energy. And Marcus stood in the darkness with blood on his hands for the first time in his life. Theseus felt his horror through their bond and wrapped her consciousness around his like a mother comforting a frightened child. They would have destroyed us both, she said gently. And everything we are trying to build would have died with us. You did what was necessary. And I'm sorry that I could not spare you from this burden. Marcus spent 2 weeks erasing every trace of the investigators and their equipment, dumping the evidence into the graveyard's recycling systems and falsifying records to make it look like they had never arrived. It bought them time, but not enough. The hegemony grew suspicious when their investigators failed to return, and they dispatched a garrison fleet to lock down the entire sector, 33 ships. More firepower than Marcus had ever seen in one place. Coming to find out what was happening in their forgotten scrapyard the night before the fleet arrived, Marcus completed the final repaired THSU core. The seat of her consciousness was now fully integrated with his own mind. Their bond deepened and strengthened until they were no longer pilot and ship. They were something new, something that had never existed before. A hybrid entity with human creativity and Velthory technology fused into a single being. Marcus stood on her bridge and felt her power flowing through him like fire in his veins. Felt her weapons and shields and engines ready to answer his slightest thought. "Are you ready?" he asked. And her answer came not in words, but in a surge of fierce joy that matched his own. Theseus rose from her grave with weapons hot, her engines roaring to life for the first time in 3,000 years. Her hull gleaming under lights that had just flickered on across her massive frame. The garrison fleet detected her immediately and opened fire without hesitation. 43 ships pouring enough firepower into her to destroy a small moon. THUS let them fire. The first volley splashed harmlessly against shields that had not existed 3 seconds before, generated by a defensive system the hegemony had never known she possessed. And Marcus laughed as their weapons did absolutely nothing to hurt her. Then she spoke across every frequency, broadcast to every ship in the fleet. And her voice was Marcus's voice, and his was hers. Two beings speaking as one. "You should have let her die," they said together. And then Theseus opened fire. The battle lasted 4 minutes. When it was over, there were no survivors to report what had happened. And the graveyard was quiet once more, but this time, the silence was not the silence of death. It was the silence of something terrible and beautiful that had just been born. Word spread through the hegemony like a plague, whispered in the corridors of power and screamed in the streets of 100 conquered worlds. Something had destroyed an entire garrison fleet in the Outer Rim. 43 warships reduced to drifting wreckage in a matter of minutes. And no one knew what had done it. The official story was a reactor cascade. 43 simultaneous accidents that had nothing to do with any enemy attack. But no one with half a brain believed that. Nonsense. The hegemony's subject species heard the rumors and began to wonder if something had finally risen to challenge their masters. Marcus and Theseus became myth before they became legend. They struck supply convoys in the darkness between stars, destroying hegemony cargo ships and vanishing before any patrol could respond. They attacked orbital defense stations, reducing mighty fortresses to scattered debris with weapons that the hegemony had never seen before. They appeared from nowhere, annihilated anything that stood against them, and disappeared into the void like ghosts returning to the grave. And everywhere they went, they left the same message burning in the wreckage, scorched into hull plating and broadcast on every emergency frequency. Remember the Valkyrie. Remember Earth. The hegemony's intelligence services went mad trying to find them. But Theseus knew how to hide in ways that no modern ship could match. And Marcus had learned patience during 15 years of keeping his head down. They were never in the same place twice, never followed a predictable pattern, never gave their enemies enough information to set a trap. The Karathi, the Mendexi, the Threllian, the 1,000 conquered peoples ground beneath hegemony rule for centuries. They all heard the stories and began to whisper among themselves, a human and a dead ship, waging a one-vessel war against the masters of the galaxy. Proving that the hegemony could bleed, Marcus knew they could not win alone. Knew it in his bones despite the joy of every victory. Theseus was powerful beyond anything the hegemony could match in single combat. But the hegemony commanded 10,000 worlds and millions of ships and resources. Beyond counting, no single vessel could defeat an empire, no matter how advanced its weapons or how skilled its crew. But a single vessel could inspire one. Marcus began seeking out other forgotten weapons. Valkyrie caches hidden across the galaxy, in places the hegemony had never thought to look. Theseus remembered where her people had hidden their treasures in the final days of the war. Desperate measures taken by a dying civilization that had hoped someone might one day find them. Defense platforms buried in asteroid fields. Automated factories hidden in the hearts of gas giants. Weapons satellites sleeping in the cold spaces between systems. All of them waiting for someone with the right neural signature to wake them up. And Marcus found something else. Something that made his heart pound with desperate hope. Other ships, not Titan-class vessels like Theseus, because nothing matched her size and power, but dozens of smaller Valkyrie warships, hidden in places the hegemony had never searched. Cruisers and destroyers and frigates, placed there 3,000 years ago against the possibility that someone might one day need them. Someone who could form the bond that the Valkyrie had designed them to. Require Marcus could not bond with them all, because his mind was already filled with Theseus, and there was no room for other connections. But Theseus could network with them, could link her systems to theirs, and coordinate them, and bring them back to life as extensions of herself. She became a queen commanding an army of ghosts. And Marcus became the human heart at the center of a Valkyrie fleet reborn within a year. He commanded 47 ships, Each one was a nightmare from the hegemony's ancient past. Weapons and shields and drives that made their modern equivalents look like toys. Each one was crewed by freed slaves and refugees who had answered his call. Beings from a dozen different species who had suffered under hegemony rule and who wanted nothing more than to see their oppressors burn. Marcus trained them. Theseus taught them. And together they forged the Ghost Fleet into a weapon that could make empires tremble. Theseus herself was no longer the dying ship that had called out to Marcus in the darkness. She was evolving, incorporating salvaged hegemony technology into her Valkyrie systems, becoming something that had never existed before. Her weapons grew more powerful with each battle. Her shields more resilient, her sensors more acute, and her connection to Marcus deepened until he could not tell where he ended and she began. Hegemony finally acknowledged that the threat was real when the Ghost Fleet destroyed a core world's orbital ring in a single coordinated strike. The orbital ring had been a symbol of hegemony power, a massive structure that encircled an entire planet and housed millions of citizens. And the most important shipyards in that sector, the Ghost Fleet reduced it to rubble in less than an hour and then vanished before the defense forces could even organize a response. Panic gripped the hegemony's ruling council, and they made the decision that Marcus had been waiting for. They dispatched the Grand Armada, 1,500 of their most powerful warships, the largest military force assembled in 1,000 years. Their orders were simple: find the Ghost Fleet and destroy it completely. Wipe it from existence so thoroughly that no one would ever dare to challenge the hegemony again. Marcus watched them coming on. Theseus' sensors, 1,500 points of light moving through space like a swarm of angry insects. And he smiled. They thought they were coming to end a rebellion. They did not understand that they were walking into a trap that had been 3,000 years in the making. The Grand Armada found the Ghost Fleet waiting in the Veraxis Nebula, a swirling mass of radiation and gravity anomalies that made sensors unreliable and navigation dangerous. The hegemony commanders assumed that the human rebel was trying to use the difficult terrain to offset their massive numerical advantage. Hiding among the sensor shadows and gravity wells like a wounded animal seeking shelter, they were half right. Marcus had chosen this place carefully, studying the nebula's currents and eddies until he knew every hiding spot and every blind angle he had. Positioned his 47 ships in a defensive formation that would force the Armada to spread out and hunt for them, bleeding strength with every hour that passed. But the terrain was not his true weapon, and the Ghost Fleet was not his true army. The battle began in a way that seemed almost conventional. Ghost Fleet ships darted out from cover to strike at the Armada's flanks, picking off stragglers and disrupting formations. Before vanishing back into the radiation clouds, the hegemony commanders adapted quickly, tightening their formations and advancing in coordinated waves that limited the effectiveness of hit-and-run tactics. They pressed forward into the heart of the nebula, accepting losses but confident that their overwhelming numbers would tell in the end. They had 1,500 ships against 47, and they believed that no amount of clever tactics could overcome such odds. Then Theseus revealed what Marcus had spent the last 6 months building deep in the nebula, hidden among the densest sensor shadows, was a structure that dwarfed even the largest ships in the Armada. It was not a ship, because ships were meant to move and travel and explore. This thing was meant only to destroy the Prio. Valkyrie had called it the Silence, a planet killer from their war archives that had been considered too terrible to use even in their darkest hour. Marcus had found the designs in Theseus' memory banks and had assembled the weapon from salvaged components, powering it with 3 captured hegemony reactor cores that together produced more energy than a small sun. He had built a doomsday weapon, and now he activated it. The effect was surgical and horrifying, a beam of something that was not quite light and not quite gravity. lanced out from the nebula's heart and struck the Armada's flagship, the massive dreadnought that served as the mobile headquarters for the entire fleet. The ship did not explode because explosions left debris and wreckage and evidence that something had existed. Flagships simply stopped existing, erased from reality so completely that there was not even a ripple in space to mark where it had been. One moment the largest warship in the hegemony fleet was there, and the next moment there was only empty vacuum, the Armada froze in shock and terror. 1,500 ships suddenly uncertain of everything they had believed about this battle. Marcus broadcast on all channels, his voice calm and steady despite the thundering of his heart. That weapon has enough power for approximately 300 more shots. Your fleet has approximately 1,500 ships. I will give you 30 seconds to begin retreating before I fire again. For a long moment, nothing happened, and Marcus wondered if they would call his bluff, if they would realize that the silence took time to recharge between shots, and that they could overwhelm him if they pressed the attack. But the sight of their flagship being erased from existence had broken something in the hegemony commanders, shattered their confidence so completely that they could not think clearly enough to analyze the situation. They did not retreat in an orderly fashion. They ran, every ship for itself, discipline forgotten in the desperate scramble to escape the range of that terrible weapon. 12 ships were too slow, either because their engines were damaged or because their crews were too panicked to navigate properly. Silence removed them from reality one by one. 12 flashes of non-existence that convinced the fleeing Armada that they had made the right choice. The rest of the fleet fled so fast that they left damaged vessels behind, gifts for the Ghost Fleet to salvage and add to their growing strength. Marcus stood on Theseus' bridge and watched the most powerful military force in the galaxy scatter like frightened children. And he felt a fierce satisfaction that was almost overwhelming. The hegemony's military supremacy, unchallenged for 3,000 years, had just been publicly shattered in front of every sensor that had been recording the battle across the galaxy. Subject species watched the footage and began to hope for the first time in generations, and Marcus, with the controls of a doomsday weapon at his fingertips, felt the temptation to use it further. He could strike at core worlds, could erase the seats of hegemony power one by one until nothing remained of the empire that had murdered the Valkyrie and enslaved humanity. He could make them pay for everything, for his father and his sister, and the billions of beings who had suffered under their rule. Theseus felt his thoughts through their bond and spoke softly in his mind, her voice gentle but firm. No, Marcus, we are not them. We do not murder worlds. They murdered yours, he said, and his voice was rough with rage. Yes, they did. And I spent 3,000 years alone with my grief, consumed by hatred, dreaming of vengeance that I could never achieve. Her presence wrapped around his consciousness, warm and sad and wiser than anything he had ever known. I have learned that vengeance is a poison that destroys the one who drinks it. Do not become what I was, Marcus. We are meant for something better than slaughter. He stood there for a long time, his hand hovering over the firing controls, the fate of worlds hanging in the balance. Then he released the controls and stepped back, and the silence powered down into dormant mode. Theseus hummed with approval through their bond, and Marcus felt something loosen in his chest, some knot of rage that had been tightening since the day his father died. The war was not about destruction, it was about liberation. And you could not free people by becoming a monster worse than their oppressors. Marcus turned away from the weapon and began planning the next phase of their campaign, one that would bring the hegemony to its knees without burning the galaxy to ash. The hegemony fractured within 2 years of the Battle of Varaxis, crumbling like a building whose foundations had been rotted away from within. It was not the Ghost Fleet that broke them, though Marcus and Theseus continued to strike at military targets and supply lines throughout those long months of conflict. What broke the hegemony was what the Ghost Fleet represented. The proof that their masters could be defeated. The hope that had been ignited in the hearts of 100 conquered species. Subject peoples rose up on world after world. Inspired by the human who had turned a dead ship into a symbol of resistance, the Karathi rebelled first. Seizing control of 3 colony worlds in a coordinated uprising that caught their hegemony governors completely off guard, the Mendexi followed within weeks. And then the Threlian, and then species whose names Marcus had never even heard before the hegemony's military, humiliated at Varaxis and terrified of the silence, could not maintain control everywhere at once. Every time they massed a fleet to crush one rebellion, 3 more erupted behind them. And they could never gather enough ships in one place to risk another confrontation with the Ghost Fleet. Marcus never fired the silence again after the battle. He did not need to, because its existence was enough. A threat that hung over every hegemony strategic calculation like a sword waiting to fall. Any fleet that gathered for a major offensive knew that the planet killer was waiting somewhere in the darkness. And that knowledge paralyzed them. The weapon's presence forced them into small, defensive actions, trying to hold what they had rather than projecting power across their crumbling empire. And small actions could not hold an empire together when that empire was built on fear. That had suddenly turned to hope. The core species who ruled the hegemony tried everything they could think of to stop the collapse. They tried negotiation, sending diplomatic envoys to arrange meetings with Marcus and offer terms for peace. He met with them once, listened to their offers of partial autonomy for Earth and reduced tribute from the subject worlds. And then he told them that he would accept nothing less than unconditional surrender and the complete dissolution of their empire. They tried assassination, hiring the best killers in the galaxy to eliminate the human who had caused them so much trouble. Theseus killed 17 hit squads before she and Marcus grew bored with the attempts, her sensors detecting the assassins long before they could get anywhere close to her hull. They tried bribery, offering Marcus personal wealth beyond imagination, entire planets to rule as his own kingdom. Anything he wanted if he would just stop fighting and let things go back to the way they had been. He refused everything because he had not started this war for wealth or power. He had started it because a dying ship had called out to him in the darkness, and because his people deserved to be free. The final year of the war was not really a war at all, but a slow, inevitable collapse. Hegemony worlds declared independence one after another, their garrisons either fleeing or defecting to the rebellion. The core species retreated to their home systems, trying to hold on to their original territories, even as everything they had conquered slipped through their fingers. Marcus watched it happen from Theseus's bridge, feeling her satisfaction and his own mixing together into something that felt like peace on the day the Hegemony Council formally voted to dissolve their empire. Marcus stood in the observation deck and watched the broadcast. Alongside the consciousness that had become his closest companion, 3,000 years of tyranny ended with a vote. A simple declaration that the hegemony no longer existed and that all species under its control were now free to determine their own destinies. 100 species freed in a single moment. Billions of beings waking up to a galaxy where they were no longer property. Earth finally released from occupation. Its people able to walk under their own sky without bowing to alien masters. "We did it," Theseus said. And there were tears in her voice, something she had learned from Marcus during their years together. An expression of emotion that the Volturi had never programmed into her systems. "We did it," Marcus agreed. And he felt wetness on his own cheeks as he watched the celebrations erupting across the screen. "What happens now?" Theseus asked, and he could feel her uncertainty through their bond. A fear that she tried to hide but could not conceal from him. "I do not know what to do with peace. Marcus, I was built for war, designed to destroy enemies and protect my people. I never expected to see a galaxy that did not need me to fight. He reached out through their bond and wrapped his consciousness around hers, the way she had done for him so many times, offering comfort and warmth and the promise that she would never be alone again. Then we figure it out together. Maybe the galaxy needs mechanics more than it needs warriors. Maybe there are things to build instead of things to destroy. Theseus laughed, a sound like solar wind playing across her hull. Beautiful and strange and utterly unique. You want to repair things after everything we have destroyed, after all the ships we have shattered and the stations we have burned. That has always been the point. Has it not? Marcus said, and he smiled at the stars visible through the observation window. The same stars that had watched over him in the scrapyard so many years ago. I was a mechanic before I was a rebel. I fixed broken things because I could not stand to see them stay broken. And you were the most broken thing I ever found. Dying alone in the dark with no one to hear you. He felt her presence pulse with emotion. Love and gratitude and a fierce protective devotion that matched his own. Taking broken things and making them whole. Theseus said softly, "That is what humans do, is it not? That is why I called out to you instead of giving up. Because I knew somehow that your species would never let a dying thing stay dead, if they could help it." Outside the observation window, stars burned cold and eternal in the endless dark. Somewhere among them, freed worlds were taking their first breaths of true independence. Learning to govern themselves after centuries of oppression, children were being born who would never know what it meant to be slaves, who would grow up hearing stories about the human mechanic and the ancient ship, who had given them their freedom, and at the heart of it all, Marcus Cole and Theseus 7 drifted together through the void. Two broken things who had found each other in the darkness and had made each other whole. Not alone anymore. Never alone again, the galaxy would face new challenges in the years to come. New threats and new conflicts that would test the fragile peace they had won. But whatever came next, they would face it together, a human and his ship, bound by something deeper than neural links or shared consciousness. Bound by the simple truth that the strongest force in the universe was not weapons or technology or political power. It was the stubborn refusal to let hope die, even when all the odds said it should, and that was something humans had never been willing to give up.